Welcome to Fright Club. The first rule of Fright Club is you do talk about Fright Club, based on true events. The maelstrom of memory. The past does not merely whisper to the present. It is a constant low hum beneath the surface of things, a vibration felt only by those who know how to listen. For Professor Alistair Finch, it was a symphony to which he had attuned his entire existence. The cacophony of the modern world was an irritant to be avoided. He preferred the clear, if mournful, voices of the dead. Their stories were complete, their fates sealed. One could study them with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon examining a specimen, without the messy complication of a future yet unwritten. His sanctuary was a gaunt, 3-story house of weathered gray shingles that clung with a kind of grim tenacity to the edge of a cliff overlooking the North Atlantic. The town below was often obscured by a perpetual shroud of sea fog. To Alistair, this isolation was not a punishment, but a prerequisite. The house was a vessel, and he its solitary captain, sailing the silent seas of history. His study, which occupied the entire top floor, was the ship's great cabin. It was a landscape of paper and leather, a massive partner's desk, its surface a palimpsest of ink blots, water rings, and the ghostly impressions of countless documents, stood as his command table. The air was a potent brew of aromas, the sweet, fungal scent of decaying paper, the sharp, clean smell of India ink, and the ever-present briny tang of the sea. It was here, on an afternoon so thick with gray mist that it blurred the line between day and night, that the package arrived. A stout, taciturn fisherman from the village paid a few coins for the errand, deposited the heavy, unmarked wooden box on his doorstep. Alistair brought the box inside, his heart beating a quiet, anticipatory rhythm. He carried it to his study and placed it on the clear space he had ritualistically cleared on his desk. The box was plain, secured with coarse, tarred twine. There was no return address, only a blurred postmark from a distant foreign port. This was the artifact promised by the lawyer's letters, the culmination of weeks of cryptic correspondence, and a retainer fee so generous it had felt like a dream. The lawyer, a Mr. Threadneedle of Threadneedle & Sons, had been impeccably professional and utterly opaque. His client, a descendant of the original owner of the schooner Usher, wished for a definitive account of the vessel's final, ill-fated voyage. The family sought closure, the letter stated, on a tragedy that had haunted them for generations. The fee offered was more than Alistair could earn in 5 years of lecturing and publishing. It was a sum that guaranteed a decade of this beautiful, isolated scholarship. He had accepted without a moment's hesitation. Now, with the reverence of an acolyte handling a holy relic, he took a brass letter opener and sliced through the twine. The lid came away to reveal a bed of fragrant wood shavings. Nestled within was the object of his commission, the logbook of the Usher. It was heavier than he expected, a substantial folio volume bound in leather that was stained a dark, bruised purple by salt and time. The metal clasp was a tarnished silver, wrought in the shape of a stylized wave, and it was rusted fast. A small, tarnished key lay atop the shavings. With a hand that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the pure, sharp thrill of the historian, he inserted the key. It turned with a gritty, resonant click that seemed to echo in the silent room. He opened the cover. The first page was a masterpiece of order. The handwriting was a flawless copperplate, each letter formed with elegant precision, the ink a faded but still legible brown. September 3rd, 1888, 40-15 N, 70-30 bond. A fair wind from the southwest, all hands in good spirits. Our course is set for the Azores, the schooner Usher proving as stout and willing a vessel as her namesake. God willing, a prosperous voyage. Captain Absalom Vane. Alistair traced the flourish of the signature with a pale finger. He could feel the ghost of the man's character in that script. Confident, meticulous, a master of his domain. He felt an immediate and profound sympathy. Here was a man like himself, a cartographer of certainty navigating a known world. Vane had his charts and sextant. Alistair had his documents and critical eye. They were both pilots in their respective realms. He read for hours as the gray light at the window faded into utter blackness. The entries were blessedly mundane. Repairs to a frayed topsail, a course correction for a contrary wind, a midday sighting of a pod of sperm whales, their spouts like geysers on the horizon. It was the dull poetry of a well-ordered voyage. He transcribed them into his own leather-bound notebook, his neat, precise script forming a parallel record to the captain's. It was only when he finally leaned back, his spine protesting with a series of sharp cracks, that he became aware of a sound that had been lurking beneath his concentration. A soft, persistent drip, drip, drip from the kitchen sink downstairs. He had heard it 1,000 times before, a minor, irritating leak he had been meaning to fix. But now, after hours immersed in the rhythmic lapping of water against a wooden hull, the sound seemed transformed. It was no longer a drip. It was a slap. The insistent, rhythmic slap of small waves against the Usher's copper-clad prow. He shook his head, a faint, self-deprecating smile touching his thin lips. Fatigue. The power of suggestion. He was merely too deep inside the narrative, a common hazard of the trade. He closed the logbook, the rusted clasp groaning like a tired soul, and decided a walk in the bracing night air was the perfect antidote to this momentary fancy. A return to the solid, unyielding reality of the present. The following days settled into a rhythm that Alistair found deeply satisfying. Mornings were dedicated to his lesser obligations. But as the afternoon light began to fail, and the fog coiled itself ever tighter around the house, he would turn to the log of the Usher. It became his secret vice, his nightly rendezvous with the past. The entries progressed with a stately pace. The weather turned. Captain Vane's flawless script began to show the first, almost imperceptible, signs of strain. October 17th, 1888. The fog has not lifted for 3 days. It is a peculiar fog, unlike any I have encountered, dense as wool and preternaturally silent. It seems to swallow all sound but the incessant, damned creaking of the ship's timbers. The men are uneasy. First Mate Higgs reports whispers among them, talk of a stillness that listens. Superstitious nonsense, of course, but it wears on the nerves. Alistair found himself nodding in agreement, a sense of camaraderie with this long-dead seaman. Superstition was the rot that weakened a crew's discipline. He admired Vane's steadfast rationality. It was on the 3rd night of this new routine that the past intruded, not from the logbook, but from the deeper vaults of his own memory. He had closed the book and was staring into the fire. The image of the steadfast Captain Vane lingering in his mind. And then, as it often did in moments of quiet, the thought of her surfaced. Ilara. It had been 2 years since the consumption had taken her. 2 years since the sound of her voice had faded from the world. He had a photograph on the mantelpiece, but it was a silent, frozen thing. What he longed for, what he would have given his soul to recover, was the sound of her singing. She had been an amateur soprano, her voice not professionally powerful, but possessed of a crystalline clarity that could fill their small parlor with pure, effortless beauty. He had tried to capture it. He had owned an early phonograph, a primitive thing with wax cylinders. He had begged her to sing into the horn just once to preserve it, but she had laughed, a sound like bells, and refused. "It would trap the soul of the song, Alistair," she had said. "A voice is for the moment, not for a tin box." Now, the moment was gone forever. He strained, squeezing his eyes shut, trying to conjure the exact timbre of her voice, singing the simple folk song she loved. But it was useless. The memory was a ghost, a silhouette without substance. The harder he grasped for it, the more it receded, until all he could hear was the blood pounding in his own ears and the incessant mocking drip from the kitchen below. A profound loneliness, colder than the sea fog, washed over him. He was a preserver of histories, yet he had failed to preserve the only history that had ever truly mattered. He looked at the logbook on the desk. In its pages, Captain Vane's voice was preserved. His thoughts, his fears, his very essence was trapped in ink, safe from the erosion of time. There was a terrible, seductive power in that. A second chance. He could preserve this story. He could ensure that Vane and his crew were not lost to silence. In a world that had taken Ilara's voice, he could at least save this one. This newfound, desperate purpose forged a deeper, more personal connection to the log. He was no longer just a historian. He was a fellow preserver, a guardian against the void. October the 29th, 1888. A strange occurrence last night. The lookout, a reliable man named Davies, swore he saw a light in the fog, a lantern on a vessel that paced us yet made no sound. We signaled. No response. When the fog broke for a moment at dawn, the sea was empty to the horizon. I have logged it as a trick of the light, a mirage born of fatigue in this interminable gray, but Davies is shaken. The mood aboard is sour, the silence heavy. As Alistair read this entry, a sudden, inexplicable chill passed through the room. The fire in the grate guttered and sank as if doused by an invisible hand. He looked up from the page. The shadows in the corners of his study seemed to have deepened. He had the distinct, unsettling impression that something had just passed by the half-open door to the hallway. He rose, his legs feeling unaccountably weak, and crossed the room. The hallway was empty, a dark tunnel leading to the sleeping quarters. Foolishness, he muttered to himself. He returned to his desk, but the cozy, scholarly atmosphere was gone, replaced by a watchful tension. Later that night, as he prepared for bed, the first true breach occurred. He was washing his face in the small, cold bathroom. As he reached for the towel, he caught his reflection in the speckled mirror. For a fraction of a second, a fleeting image superimposed over his own gaunt features, a face with a strong, weathered jaw, a neatly trimmed beard shot through with gray, and eyes wide with desperate resolve. It was the face from the daguerreotype. Captain Absalom Vane. Alistair stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked, and his own terrified reflection stared back. A waking dream. He had been spending too many hours in the company of the dead. He needed rest. But as he lay in the dark, the house groaning around him, he could not escape the feeling. The face in the mirror had not looked like a phantom. It had looked present. And the drip from the kitchen sink no longer sounded like waves. It sounded like the slow, measured ticking of a clock, counting down. The incident with the mirror marked a turning point. The following week was a study in creeping disquiet. Alistair's sleep became a treacherous landscape of fragmented visions, the feel of coarse, wet rope, the taste of salt pork. He would wake with a start, his mouth tasting of the ocean, his sheets damp with a cold sweat that smelled of low tide. He tried to armor himself with rationality. He responded by doubling down on his work, but now his approach changed. It was no longer mere transcription. It became an autopsy. He was no longer reading a log. He was dissecting a corpse. He began a new, more intense phase of examination. He laid out his tools: a magnifying glass, a set of brass calipers, clean sheets of blotting paper. He started again from the beginning, but now his focus was on the physicality of the book itself. He noted how the paper quality changed subtly after the first month. It was slightly rougher, more porous, as if supplied from a different source or affected by the damp air. He measured the flow of ink from one entry to the next, deducing that Vane had sharpened his quill with meticulous care on September 28th, the lines becoming finer and more precise. But by October 10th, a faint tremor was detectable, not in the words, but in the very flow of the ink. A minute, almost imperceptible waver on the downstrokes of the Y's and G's. It was the first physical symptom of the captain's unease, a tremor in the hand that preceded the tremor in the prose. He found a pressed flower, a small, faded sprig of sea lavender, between the pages of an entry dated mid-October. Had Vane placed it there? A memento of a last sight of land? Or was it a later addition, a pathetic attempt by a grieving relative to inject a note of beauty into the gathering horror? Alistair spent an hour sketching it in the margin of his own notebook, obsessing over its possible meaning. Then there were the stains. Most were simple water spots, but one, a rust-colored bloom near an entry from late October, captivated him. He sniffed it, a faint metallic odor. Was it tea? Wine? Or was it, as his macabre imagination suggested, a drop of blood, flicked from a hand cracked by cold and tension? He transcribed the adjacent text with extra care, as if the stain held the key to its meaning. The men grow sullen. A minor altercation over rations today. Jenkins struck Miller. The air is thick with a discontent that has no single source. He was building a case, not for a court of law, but for the court of his own mind. He was proving, through tangible evidence, the slow descent of the usher from a functioning vessel into a floating asylum. And with every piece of evidence catalogued, every minute detail recorded, he felt himself sinking deeper into the narrative. He wasn't just observing the storm, he was calibrating his own instruments to measure its approach. The hallucinations, once fleeting, began to solidify alongside his research. The smell of salt became a constant companion. He saw from the corner of his eye a figure standing motionless in the hallway, a tall, gaunt shape in a dark, dripping coat. He named it the Captain. Alistair's own demeanor began to mirror the decay he was documenting. He neglected his appearance. His meals tasted of brine. He muttered arguments with the logbook. "It was a squall, man," he snapped one evening, jabbing a finger at a despairing entry. "A freak of meteorology, not a curse." But his voice sounded reedy and desperate. The rational world was receding. He was no longer just studying the descent into madness. He was conducting a joint experiment with the past, and the results were becoming alarmingly personal. The logbook was no longer a document. It was a live feed from a sinking ship, and he was not just the receiver. He was now a participant in the experiment. The hallucinations were no longer mere interruptions. They were becoming the very fabric of his existence. The smell of salt and decay was a constant presence, a miasma he carried in his nostrils and lungs. A dank, penetrating chill, the cold of deep ocean trenches, had seeped into his clothes, his bones. The figure of the captain was now a regular occupant of the peripheral shadows, a silent, dripping sentinel whose presence was felt more than seen. His larder, never well stocked, was now nearly bare. The last of the bread was a hard, mold-flecked brick. The tea leaves were dust. The practical need for sustenance finally overpowered his desire to remain sequestered with the logbook. With great reluctance, he decided he must venture down to the village. The journey was a shock to his system. As he stepped out of his front door, the daylight, though filtered through the ever-present fog, felt assaultively bright. The path down the cliff, once familiar, seemed alien and treacherous, the gulls' cries like the shrieks of tortured souls. He felt unmoored, a deep-sea creature dragged to the surface, his senses raw and overwhelmed. The village, when he reached it, was a tableau of jarring normalcy. The air smelled of fresh baked bread and smoked fish, a stark, almost offensive contrast to the funereal odor of his study. The sounds were a cacophony. The clatter of a cart on the cobblestones, the boisterous laughter from the open door of the public house, the cheerful call of a fishmonger. He saw faces, red-cheeked, robust, concerned with the price of mackerel and the mending of nets. They were the faces of men who lived in the present, whose world was solid, tangible, defined by the catch of the day and the turning of the tides in a literal, not a metaphysical sense. He moved among them like a ghost. He received nods, but they were cautious, accompanied by averted eyes. He was the professor from the cliff, a figure of pity and suspicion. Children would stop their games to stare at his gaunt frame and too pale face before being hurried away by their mothers. In the general store, the shopkeeper, a Mr. Dobbs, took his order for basic provisions with a brisk, impersonal efficiency. "Fog's been particular thick, Professor," Dobbs remarked, weighing out tea. "Here it's worse up on the height." Alistair merely nodded, his throat tight. He could not explain that the fog he inhabited was not outside his window, but inside his mind. He could not describe the silence that listened, or the figure in the dripping coat. To these people, such things were the stuff of superstitious gossip, not daily reality. Their world had walls, and those walls were solid. His were dissolving. As he stood waiting, his eyes fell upon a group of old sailors mending nets by the wharf. They were talking, their voices a low rumble. For a wild, disorienting moment, Alistair didn't hear English. He heard the guttural, panicked whispers from the logbook, the mutterings of the usher's crew. He saw not the grizzled but contented faces of retired seamen, but the fear-widened eyes of men staring into an abyss. He had to look away, his heart hammering. The walk back up the cliff was an ordeal. Each step away from the vibrant, noisy village felt like a descent into a deeper, more profound silence. The basket of provisions in his hand felt absurd, a token from a world that was no longer his. By the time his house came into view, a dark shape in the fog, the sounds of the village had faded completely, replaced by the oppressive quiet and the now audible sound of the waves crashing below, waves that now sounded like hungry mouths. He practically fled inside, slamming the door shut against the world. Leaning against it, gasping for breath, he felt a perverse sense of relief. The village, with its brutal, simple reality, had been the true nightmare. This, the silent, watching house, the waiting logbook, this was his sanctuary. This was where the real work was being done. The foray into the world of the living had not grounded him. It had severed his last, tenuous connection to it. He was now fully a citizen of the Usher, and its port of call was his study. He did not even unpack the groceries. He went straight to his desk, his hands shaking as he opened the logbook. The entries had grown darker, more fragmented. November the 5th, 1888. The silence is the worst of it. This damned fog is a pall, muffling everything. A man can shout from the bow and his voice is deadened, swallowed whole before it reaches the stern. The men go about their duties with a sullen, watchful fear. They claim to hear things, voices in the fog that are not ours, that call their names in the tones of loved ones. I have ordered double watches, though for what purpose I cannot say. What enemy can one fight but the air itself? As Alistair read this, a profound and absolute silence descended upon his own house. The usual nocturnal chorus was extinguished. The only sound was the frantic scratching of his own pen. He stopped, holding his breath. The silence was not empty. It was thick, expectant. It was the very silence Vane described. He pushed back from his desk and strode to the window, throwing it open. The fog poured in, carrying the rich, fecund stench of a beach at low tide. It was overpowering, cloying. He slammed the window shut, his heart hammering. This was no longer suggestion. This was a sensory assault. He turned back to his study, and his eyes fell upon a dark patch on the faded green rug near the fireplace. It was a wet patch, roughly the size and shape of a man lying prone. As he stared, it seemed to darken, a glistening dampness spreading through the fibers. He could smell the salt water on it. "No," he whispered, closing his eyes tightly. "It is a shadow." He counted to 10. When he opened his eyes, the patch was gone. The rug was dry. But the phantom smell of the sea lingered, a taunt. The world of the village was a distant dream. The world of the Usher was the only reality. The logbook's final, frantic pages were a descent into pure, unvarnished chaos. The elegant script of Captain Vane disintegrated into a frantic, spidery scrawl, the ink blotted and smeared. Then, other hands began to intrude upon the record, the shaky, block-like letters of a terrified sailor, the manic, ink-splattered scratches of the first mate. It was a cacophony of panic, a chorus of unraveling minds, an entry in an unknown hand, the water in the barrels. It tastes of salt, even the fresh. It all tastes of the sea. Cook says the biscuits are soft, damp. It is getting inside. The ship is weeping. A sketch, crude and terrifying, filled the next page. It depicted a crewman with wide, empty circles for eyes and a mouth open in a silent scream. Most horrifying were the dark, tentacular shapes emerging from his sleeves and collar. Vane's hand, but barely legible. Higgs is gone. Not overboard, not sick, just gone from his bunk. The men say they saw him rise and walk into the fog on the deck. They say the fog spoke to him with their voices. God help us. The silence has learned to speak. It is learning our voices. Alistair read these entries in a state of feverish, sleep-deprived exhaustion. Time had become soft and malleable. The world outside his window had ceased to exist. There was only the fog and the four walls of his study, which felt less like a room and more like a ship's cabin, adrift on a ghostly sea. The hallucinations were now his primary reality. He read an entry describing a sailor's consumptive cough. Immediately, a tickle formed in Alistair's own throat. It grew into a hack, then a racking, convulsive cough that bent him double over the desk, his lungs burning as if he'd inhaled salt water. He could taste the coppery tang of blood. The house itself had become the usher. The groaning of its timbers was the agonized protest of a ship's hull. The wind whistling through a cracked window became the shriek of a gale through rigging. He found himself bracing against the floor when a gust hit, expecting the world to tilt. One night, the storm broke inside his mind. He was reading the final, coherent entry from Vane. It is not a storm without. It is a storm within. The sea, it is not water. It is a mind. A vast, cold, ancient mind that knows nothing of us but is suddenly, terribly aware. And it has turned its attention upon us. We are not sinking. We are being known, studied. And in the knowing, we are unmade. Our thoughts are not our own. The maelstrom is not in the ocean. It is in the soul. It is the vortex that opens when a small mind is touched by an infinite one. As he read these words, a sound began. It started as a low moan but swelled into a deafening, mind-shattering roar. The sound of a hurricane, of waves crashing, of a ship being torn apart. The oil lamp on his desk flickered wildly before dying, plunging the study into absolute blackness. Alistair cried out, his voice lost. He stumbled from his chair, the floor lurching violently, sending him sprawling against a bookcase. Volumes rained down upon him. He crawled through the darkness, the howling wind of physical pressure. He was on the deck of the usher. He felt the sting of spray, the slippery wetness of the planks. Through the chaos, he saw the captain clearly. Absalom Vane, braced at the far end of the room, his face a mask of terrified resignation, staring into the abyss. "Vane!" Alistair screamed. "What must I do?" The figure turned its head slowly. Their eyes met, and Alistair knew a thought, implanted directly into his consciousness. Finish the log. Complete the record. It is the only way. Then, silence. The storm ceased. The lights did not come back on, but a faint, phosphorescent glow seemed to emanate from the walls. Alistair was on his hands and knees, surrounded by wreckage, trembling uncontrollably. The phantom of Vane was gone. But the command remained, burning in his brain. Finish the log. He knew then, with absolute certainty, that the story of the usher had been waiting for him. The historian was to become the final chapter. The storm had passed, but the sea change within Alistair Finch was total and irreversible. The frantic, animal energy of terror had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hollow, and eerily lucid calm. The hallucinations did not cease. They simply became the accepted parameters of his new reality. The salt rime that now seemed to perpetually coat the windows was a fact of his environment. The constant, low groan of the ship's, no, the house's timbers, was the fundamental soundtrack of existence. The line between scholar and subject had not just blurred, it had been annihilated. He was a component of the narrative now, a final, necessary entry waiting to be inscribed. He moved through the wreckage of his study with a somnambulist's grace, his movements slow and deliberate. The fallen books were flotsam on the deck. The inkwell spilled across his desk was a dark sea chart of some unknown ocean. His own body felt alien, a vessel operated by a distant, implacable will. The face that stared back from the dark, salt-clouded glass of the window was not his own. It was a palimpsest, his own gaunt features etched like a faint transparency over the grim, weather-beaten visage of Absalom Vane. They were co-captains of this damned voyage, their identities merging into a single, doomed consciousness. The command echoed in the hollows of his mind, a fixed star in his spinning universe, the only point of clarity left. finish the log. He understood now, with a clarity that transcended thought. The usher had not been destroyed by a physical whirlpool or a rogue wave. It had been unmade by a truth too vast and alien for the human mind to hold. The sea was not a thing of water and salt. It was a consciousness, ancient, patient, and utterly indifferent. It had, for a fleeting moment, turned its attention to the tiny, thinking organism that was the schooner Usher. The weight of that attention had been a psychic gravity, an intellectual pressure that had pulled the crew's sanity into a crushing singularity of madness. The logbook was not merely a record. It was a conduit, a focal point. And in his obsessive empathy, his scholarly desire to not just know but to feel the past, Alistair had reopened the channel. He had offered up his own mind as a laboratory. He was not being haunted. He was being assimilated. The sea was completing its experiment. He righted his chair and sat before the logbook. It lay open on the desk, the final, blank page a stark and accusing expanse of vellum. This, he saw now, was the purpose of his life's work, his isolation, his innate melancholy. He had been groomed for this, shaped by loss and a preference for the dead, to become the final witness. The sea, through the log, sought to know itself through a human mind one last time, to complete the data set it had begun a century prior. He was the control, the man on land, and the result was the same. The conclusion was inevitable. His hand, when he reached for his pen, did not tremble. It felt strong, sure, calloused, as if it had spent years gripping a ship's wheel against the pull of the tide. He dipped the nib not into his own bottle of modern blue ink, but into a crusted well of thick black India ink he had found in a drawer, its consistency resembling the ancient entries of the past. He did not think of words. They came unbidden, rising from the deep well of shared memory that now flooded his psyche. It was Vane's voice, his own voice, the voices of the crew, all synthesized into one final, despairing report to a cosmos that would not, could not care. The final latitude is that of the soul. We have sailed beyond the maps, beyond the very stars that once guided us. The enemy was not the storm, but the silence that preceded it, a silence that contemplated us, that found us interesting. He wrote with a swift, sure hand, the script a perfect, uncanny replica of Vane's early precision, yet charged with a terrible, final certainty. The men were not lost to the waves. They were unknitted, their thoughts unraveled like old rope, their fears given form and substance. Higgs saw his drowned father beckoning from the fog and walked into his arms. Others simply ceased to be, their minds unable to bear the pressure of being known by something so vast. It is a cosmological indifference, a curiosity that destroys. A drop of moisture fell from his forehead, spotting the page. It was not sweat. It was seawater, cold and briny. He could feel the deck tilting beneath him, a slow, sickening roll. The air in the room grew heavy and cold, the pressure changing as if he were descending into the depths. The maelstrom is not a place. It is a state of understanding. It is the realization that we are not the observers of the abyss, but its object. The sea does not wish to drown us. It wishes to comprehend us. And in that act of comprehension, we are extinguished. I feel it now. The cold, intellectual curiosity. It is not malice. It is simply other. To be known by it is to be dissolved. My thoughts are no longer my own. They are becoming its thoughts. My memories are becoming its data. This log is the last spark of a separate consciousness. When this entry is complete, Alistair Finch will cease to be. There will only be the knowing. He scrawled the final words, his hand shaking now, as the last, desperate vestiges of his individual self fought against the tide of the infinite. It is done. The sea has found its historian. The record is complete. He dropped the pen. It clattered onto the desk, a sound as small and insignificant as a dying man's last breath. Alistair leaned back in his chair. He felt a profound, unimaginable peace. The peace of absolute surrender. The room around him shimmered, lost its solidity. The bookshelves melted into waves of dark water. The ceiling dissolved into a sky of churning, starless black. The cold was inside him now, filling him. And it was not unpleasant. It was the end of struggle, the end of loneliness, the end of self. The last thing he saw was the phantom of Captain Vane standing across from him. But the figure was no longer separate. It smiled, a sad, understanding smile that held a universe of sorrow, and then stepped forward, merging into him. They were one. The cycle was closed. The data was recorded. A final, clear, singular thought echoed in the vanishing chamber of his mind, a thought that belonged to both of them and to neither. I have charted the final latitude. The abyss is not below, but within. Then there was only the silent, infinite, knowing sea. 3 weeks passed. In the village below the cliffs, life continued with the stolid rhythm of a place accustomed to the sea's fickle moods. The fog came and went. Boats went out and, God willing, returned. The strange professor in the house on the cliff was largely forgotten, a peripheral figure at best. But for the landlord, a practical, unsentimental man named Gerald Henderson, the professor had become an irritation. The quarterly rent was 7 days overdue, and no response had come to the discreet note he had slipped under the door. On a morning that dawned with unusual clarity, the sky a hard, brilliant blue, Henderson decided to act. He trudged up the winding, overgrown path to the house, a formal notice of eviction crisp in his hand. The place had always gave him a queer feeling, even on a day like this. It wasn't just the isolation. It was the profound quiet that seemed to emanate from it, a stillness that felt less like absence and more like a held breath. Today, that silence was absolute. No smoke curled from the chimney. The windows were dark, blank eyes staring out at the sea. The vibrant blue of the sky seemed to stop at the property line, as if repelled by the gray shingles. He knocked sharply on the heavy oak door. The sound flat and dead, swallowed by the wood. No answer. He tried the brass knob. It turned easily in his hand. Unlocked. The smell that hit him as he pushed the door open was a physical blow. It was the stench of the ocean at its most primordial, not the fresh, salty air of the harbor, but the foul, choking odor of a tide pool left to bake in the sun, of rotting kelp, of shellfish corpses, and beneath it all, a sharp, metallic tang like old blood. It was a smell that had no business inside a human dwelling. "Professor Finch," he called out, his voice strained. The word professor echoed faintly in the narrow entrance hall, but Finch died in the thick air. No response, save for the frantic, sudden ticking of the grandfather clock at the foot of the stairs, as if startled into action by his intrusion. The lower floor was neat, but oppressively still. A fine layer of dust had settled on the hall table. The kitchen was clean, but cold. The real source of the odor was upstairs. It pulled him upward, a foul tide. He pushed open the door to the study and stopped short, his jaw going slack with a mixture of revulsion and disbelief. The room was a shambles. Books were strewn across the floor as if by a great careless hand. A heavy armchair was overturned. A reading lamp lay on its side, its glass shade shattered. But it was the state of the room itself that was truly horrifying. Every surface was covered in a white, crystalline crust. It coated the bookshelves like frost, glittered on the windowsills, and lay in drifts across the desk. Henderson reached out a tentative finger and touched the stuff on the doorframe. It was coarse and sharp. Salt. It was as if the room had been submerged in seawater and then left to evaporate, leaving the ocean's residue behind. The air was so saturated with it that it dried the back of his throat. In the center of this bizarre, frozen wreckage, the great mahogany desk stood like an altar. Upon it, isolated in a circle of relative order, lay a single open book, the famous logbook, he presumed, the one the professor had gone on about in his rare, excited visits to the village post office. Henderson approached, his boots crunching unnaturally loud on the salty floorboards. The logbook was open to the final pages. The left-hand page was filled with the frantic, deteriorating script of a madman from a century past, a chaotic scrawl of terror that was barely legible. The right-hand page, which should have been blank, was not. On it, in a hand that was neat, precise, and chillingly familiar, Henderson had seen the professor's elegant script on rental agreements and various forms, was a fresh entry. The ink was a deep, recent black, stark against the yellowed vellum. It consisted of a single, stark sentence, written with an air of absolute, unshakable finality that made the landlord's blood run cold. He was not a man of letters. He did not understand the metaphysical horror behind the words, but he understood desolation. He understood a farewell. This was not a note. It was an epitaph. He backed out of the room, a cold sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. He stumbled down the stairs, the eviction notice fluttering from his numb fingers onto the hall floor. He burst out into the clean, bright air, gasping as if he'd been drowning. He leaned against the side of the house, the solid wood a reassurance, and vomited onto the grass. The authorities were summoned. The local constable, a man named Evans, arrived with a deputy. They were met by Henderson, pale and shaken, on the path. Their initial skepticism vanished the moment they crossed the threshold and smelled the air. The investigation that followed was swift and suffused with a deep, unspoken unease. They found no sign of a struggle, no evidence of foul play. Professor Alistair Finch's heavy wool coat still hung on the rack. His wallet, containing a respectable sum of money, was on his bedside table. His suitcase was in the closet. It was as if he had simply vaporized from the center of that salt-crusted study. The official conclusion, dictated by a need for order and a fear of the inexplicable, was presumed lost at sea. It was the only explanation that fit, however imperfectly. A tragic accident for a man known to be eccentric and to walk the cliffs at all hours. The case was closed. The logbook of the usher was catalogued, placed in an evidence box, and eventually returned to the lawyers at Threadneedle and Sons. Its final, mysterious entry was noted as a curiosity, a subject of macabre gossip before being forgotten. The leading theory was that the disturbed professor had forged it as a final, dramatic gesture before taking his own life. Weeks later, in his London office, Mr. Threadneedle received the package containing the logbook. He followed his client's precise instructions, forwarding it to a numbered postal box in a distant, fog-bound coastal town. Not the one where Professor Finch had lived, but another, equally desolate. The task was distasteful, but the fee had been more than generous. A few days after, a reply arrived at Threadneedle's office. It was not a letter, but a single sheet of heavy, water-stained parchment, sealed with a blob of dark wax that bore no imprint. Inside, in a handwriting that was fluid, ancient, and utterly alien, was a single sentence of thanks. The ink was a peculiar iridescent black, and the paper was damp to the touch, carrying a faint, unmistakable smell of salt and the deep, deep sea. Mr. Threadneedle read the note, his professional composure cracking for a single, unguarded moment. A shiver, completely unrelated to the draft in his office, passed through him. He quickly folded the parchment, locked it in his safe, and tried to put the entire unsettling affair and the fate of the peculiar Professor Finch out of his mind forever. But sometimes, on foggy nights, Gerald Henderson would stand at his own window and look up at the dark outline of the house on the cliff, and he would remember, with a clarity that never faded, the absolute certainty in that freshly inked sentence. It was not the writing of a suicidal man. It was the writing of a man who had already ceased to exist, penning a message from the other side of a terrible threshold, for the sole purpose of completing a story that had been waiting 100 years for its end. The sentence read, "The sea has found its historian. The record is complete.